I've been asked to talk particularly about where did UN peacekeeping stray from its successful track record and how can it get back on track. So my talk is going to focus on maybe one very particular area of the broader work that we are all engaged in the area of peace and war. But I do think this is a very interesting area because UN peacekeeping operations is a manifestation of global cooperation in, of course, the context of the broader United Nations Charter. And it is something that have been practiced now for 75 years since the first UN operations were deployed. In fact, the first operation is still underway, the United Nations Truce Supervision Operation. And a group that I'm coordinating, the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, we're actually doing a study on UNSO to try and to understand how is that particular operation functioning and whether it is effective, and if so, how is it working. So we have a team working on that, and they will actually produce a report later this year. But what I wanted to talk about is the fact that on the one hand, when we look at our research on UN peace operations and its legacy over these past 75 years or so, we see that this has been a highly successful institution, if you like, over this period. Overall, if we look at all the operations that the United Nations has undertaken over this period, we can see clear statistical correlation between the benefit of having UN peacekeeping operations involved in bringing conflicts to an end and helping societies transition out of conflict, compared to those situations and experiences where, in many cases, those experiences did not benefit from having a UN peacekeeping operation accompany that process. And the research shows us that where you do have a UN peacekeeping operation, that very often the time that it takes for that conflict to either relapse into conflict or to become a situation of under stress again is much longer compared to the others. There's less spillover effect, and overall there's less civilian deaths in the situations where UN peacekeeping operations accompany these processes. So we have this overall track record that's very positive. But we have a situation at the moment over the last few years where we can say UN peacekeeping is in crisis. We have a number of operations currently deployed, large peacekeeping operations that we also call stabilization operations, in places like Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic, that have been, in the case of the Congo, deployed for more than 2 decades, the others shorter periods of time. And in almost all of these situations, we can see that despite the fact that the peace operations have been deployed, that the number of civilian deaths are increasing over time. So these particular operations have not been as successful as the broader body of operations that we've discussed. And so we've tried to look into to understand what exactly is it that is different from these operations than from the larger body of operations that we've studied. And the main thing that we've discovered is that the key distinction between these operations and many of the others in the past is that these operations have tried to stabilize situations in conflict without there being what I would call a clear political project in place. There's no peace agreement in place, or the peace agreements that are in place have been very weak, or they've been surpassed by events. But if we summarize all of that, I would say that the core distinction is this lack of a clear political project. And what we have seen is that the UN peacekeeping operations have also changed, over different periods in response to different needs. But since about the the late 1990s, peacekeeping overall has also shifted, I would say, from conflict resolution to conflict management, in the sense that the operations were largely about supporting and accompanying peace processes up to that time. But because of a number of events at that time, the focus has shifted to protection of civilians and stabilization. So away from necessarily implementing peace agreements, but more towards, whilst there's ongoing conflict, what can the United Nations try to do to try to alleviate suffering, to protect people that are at risk from conflict? And although this is a noble cause and something that is certainly needed, I think what we've realized over time is that it also has a number of perverse effects. So we have what I would call the stabilization dilemma, which is essentially that if through a UN peacekeeping operation, in the absence of a political project, we are relatively successful in providing protection to civilians and stabilizing a situation, we end up in a situation where the political elites in the country have no incentive to make the kind of political compromises that are necessary to bring the conflict to an end. Because the UN is basically removing the stone in the shoe for them, right? If they are not somehow under existential risk of being replaced by opponents, and they need to find a negotiated solution for the way forward, the elites that have captured the state, in a sense, are quite comfortable at that moment in time with just continuing in the situation that they're in. Of course, stabilization, this kind of stabilization also assumes that there's some kind of a legitimate state in place and the United Nations are helping to protect that legitimate state from an insurgence or other form of illegitimate, violent threat to that regime. But what we find in reality is that many of these regimes are not necessarily legitimate in the way that we would normally associate with the idea of a legitimate state. Right? These are very often one set of elites that have captured the state, and other elites, other communities in those states are feeling marginalized, feeling excluded, and after years of trying various forms, some of the groups in those communities may be resorting to violence as a way of trying to change the status quo. So I think it's important in this context for the United Nations also to think broader about the situation that they're in and to deal with this kind of unintended consequences that this approach has brought about. I mean, some of the side effects that I think this produce is, first of all, as you can imagine, without a clear political project and without an incentive from those in power to seek political compromise or political settlement with others, you end up in a situation where there's no exit strategy, no ability for the United Nations to leave at some point because the conflict is continuing at a low level, no process underway to bring it to an end. And so you have this perpetual presence and frustration that builds up with the presence of the United Nations. The longer you are there, the more you become part of the political economy. When we are there as the United Nations, we rent space, huge space. We have to host all our soldiers in bases. We need all kinds of offices. We need to rent private security. We need to procure all kinds of things for those operations. And of course, most property and existing companies that can provide these services are usually associated with the elites in power. Right? So you build up a political economy, which creates also an incentive for people to try and keep you there because that makes good business sense. Another aspect which I think we don't often think about enough is that if we deploy peacekeepers and part of their mandate is to disrupt the insurgent groups or the violent extremist groups that are a risk to the state and to people, but we don't mandate them or give them enough resources to actually overwhelm those forces. what you are really doing is you are stimulating the development and the resilience of these insurgent forces, because you disrupt them, you threaten them, they have to respond, they have to adapt, but you don't do it in a way that actually is an existential threat to them, right? So we actually putting them through a training program and making them more effective in the work that they're doing, and we can see the results in these places where we've been for a long time. So I think these are some of the kind of negative side effects or perverse effects of what happens with the stabilization dilemma that we don't always take into account or consider. There's a huge risk when we deploy UN peacekeeping operations or other similar type of UN endeavors, that because it's the United Nations, we assume we can do no wrong. Because our intentions is good, we assume the outcome will be good, right? And I think this is where it's very important to realize that whenever you try to influence a complex system, including a society, there's going to be a range of consequences, some of which you intend. That's why you deploy in the first place. You have certain assumptions about what your operations will achieve, but many others which you can't possibly foresee. And if we make if we make the mistake of just focusing on those intended effects, and for instance, when we assess our performance, we just assess our performance against our intended effects, we become blind to all the unintended consequences that our operation may generate. Some of them may be positive, and you would actually want to know about them so that you can scale them up and build on them. We do many positive things by mistake, right? And we're like, oh, wow, I didn't intend to do that, but yeah, that seems to work. Let's do more of that. But also we do we can cause harm. We do cause harm, and we need to pick that up as quickly as possible so that we can adapt and do things differently. So for me, this is some of the core dilemma that we have with UN peacekeeping at the moment. And I would say that has contributed massively to two large trends we see at the moment in peace operations. Firstly, a trend towards contraction or moderation. So since 2014, there's been no new UN peacekeeping operations deployed. And since that time, the overall budget of UN peacekeeping has gone from about $8 billion to $6 billion. There are other reasons as well, including the financial crisis and especially the Trump administration, who had a very specific policy to reduce support to UN peacekeeping operations. And of course, there's the larger global context that we find ourselves in as well. That certainly plays a role, because it becomes much more difficult in the Security Council, for instance, to find agreement on deploying new operations. But certainly part of the reason for this contraction and moderation is challenges related to performance. John mentioned some of the work we did in the context of applying ideas of complexity to peace operations. And so a colleague of mine, Emery Brisset, and I were asked some years ago, around 2017, I guess it was, to help assess the systems that the United Nations use for measuring the performance of their peacekeeping operations. And when we did that, we realized that although there's a number of processes that the United Nations use, none of them accumulate to the overall ability of the Secretariat to be able to say that a particular operation is effective or not, or is performing well or not. It can make that judgment about various sub-elements, units, or the role of a particular leader, and so on. And so we suggested that they develop what we call the comprehensive performance assessment system. And we very much used, I would say, complexity theory thinking in the design of that system. We were very surprised when they actually agreed to implement the system and asked us to help them to further design and implement it over time. But some of the core things I would say that was different as a result of this kind of thinking is in the past, very often when you want to measure the performance of a large set of activities like that, you would develop a set of criteria of what you want to achieve at the level of the headquarters or international level. So the SDGs would be a good example, right? We agree all that these are the 17 major goals we want to pursue, but then we also go a step further and we develop a number of indicators and targets related to those 17 goals. And we thought that that's something we need to avoid in the peacekeeping operation context, because although you have at that point probably 18, 17 peacekeeping operations deployed worldwide, and this was probably at that time, can't say exactly, but maybe a $6 billion business with maybe 100,000 people deployed in 16 operations in some of the most difficult parts of the world, so a large operation. And there would be certainly a temptation to try and develop a central set of criteria. But what we did is we helped them to develop a system where each of the operations needed to make an assessment within their own context of what they need to do in order to implement their mandates and achieve the best possible performance that they can. So first of all, the fact that these operations had to make those judgments in a context-specific way. So yes, we have this mandate, but we need to understand in the particular context whether we're in the Congo or Mali or Sudan, we need to understand what are the main drivers that we need to influence and who are the key stakeholders behind those drivers that we need to influence. In what direction do we want to influence them? How do we track that? So a results system, but based on a very context-specific situational awareness of how you need to achieve your mandate. And then the second aspect that I think comes from a complexity theory application is that we know that very often when we do development programs, we evaluate those in a midterm process. So if the program is maybe 3 years, a 3-year program, after a year and a half, we would evaluate the program with a view to thinking about how can we improve the program for the remaining year, or very often we do those kind of evaluations towards the end of the program cycle to make a judgment whether we should have another project, whether the project should continue or not. But realizing that these operations operate in highly dynamic, non-linear, fast-changing situations, we argued for a cycle of reflection of every 4 months. So a quarterly cycle where the people involved in carrying out these activities needed to sit down in groups. So for instance, everybody that's involved in protection, and this will be people from many different people from across the mission, some military people, police people, people responsible for protection or human rights or many other dimensions that contribute to that overall objective, needs to sit down and assess their activities and ask themselves, is this activity that we've been undertaking over the last 4 months, is it contributing to achieving our objective? And we've had a number of subset of questions around relevance and duration and so on that I won't bore you with. But the bottom line is that to adapt to fast-changing circumstances where these operations are, they need to very regularly reflect on how well they are doing and make decisions about which of those activities should continue, they are working, which of them are creating the kind of consequences we spoke about that you want to either discontinue or you want to create further diversity and experiment with a further diversity of activities, so that you can continuously reflect and make decisions about how to do things differently so that you can perform better in future. And we found that through this activity, I would say 2 things have changed quite rapidly. One is people became much more realistic about what you can call their theory of change, right? So you would have a program where you do training in a prison for prison guards. Your overall aim is maybe to reduce torture and human rights abuse, and you do human rights training. But through this process, you may realize that, well, maybe we're training too few people, we're training the wrong people, or training individuals may not make a lot of difference if there is other structural reasons in the prison management system of that particular prison or the system as a whole, which are encouraging this kind of behavior. So it's a kind of a reality check that make people think about, is this activity I'm performing actually going to make the changes I would like to see? Especially because in that institution, peacekeeping, people come and go quite a lot. Soldiers come some every 6 months, some every year, but most of the staff turn over quite rapidly, which means that you sometimes arrive in a position and things have been done in a certain way, and you don't really have the space to think about why are we doing this exactly, the way we're doing it, but you're just picking up and continuing with the way things have been done before, unless you create this kind of reflexive moment, right, where people are given the space to actually judge for themselves whether what they're doing is making the contribution or not. So I think that was an important thing. And the other I would say, benefit we saw quite immediately is that within that group of people who were sitting and talking about this and reflecting together, they could immediately see opportunities for adaptation that they could make to their programming that didn't require them to go all the way to the top to get some changed decision. These are things that they could immediately within their own agency change and adapt to make the work that they're doing much more meaningful and higher performance. So those are just some sharing some insights to you of how a conceptual thinking like complexity theory can also be applied to a very large bureaucratic institution like the United Nations in a situation like this, in a certain context. So, not that I think this particular program that I told you about is, going to change peacekeeping operations on its own, because it is, of course, the larger mandate that these missions are receiving from the Security Council that is making the important difference. And here I think, and the UN Secretary General has just released in July also a policy document called the New Agenda for Peace that speaks to a broad range of issues relevant for us in terms of the changing character of war and peacemaking. But in one particular set of recommendations also related to peace operations or to peacekeeping. And I think we can see in that document and the Secretary General's guidance as well, this recognition that for UN peacekeeping operations to work, you need this focus on a political project. We must remember that ultimately you are dealing with a political conflict, and it's that conflict that you want to resolve, and therefore it's a political solution that is needed at the end of the day. A peacekeeping operation can play a role in helping to implement a peace agreement. It can accompany that process, it can provide guarantees and so on, but it's not an end of itself. It needs to support and be a service to a larger peacemaking or political project. So I think that's the core of what the lesson we've learned here. And it's interesting that in this New Agenda for Peace, there's also a recognition of the other larger trend that I want to highlight. So I spoke about we have seen this contraction and moderation. The other major trend I would say is partnerships. That the United Nations realize that there are certain things that peacekeeping is good at, and there are certain things that it can't do. And peacekeeping is not good with war fighting, or with what we in the UN terms call enforcement. So the New Agenda for Peace calls for greater partnership in those contexts where the Security Council recognize that there's a need to, for instance, undertake operations to counter terrorism or to counter violent extremism, but recognizing that UN peacekeeping operations are not the right tool for that, and that the UN has to partner, as we've done before. I, for instance, served in East Timor back in 1999, when an Australian-led, a New Zealand-led coalition, Interfet, was deployed immediately in the aftermath of the violence and when there was a popular consultation about independence for East Timor. And this coalition of the willing, made up of a number of countries from the region, stabilized the situation, and then the United Nations peacekeeping operations took over about 3-4 months later once the situation has been stabilized. So it's not a new, but it's a recognition, it's not a new idea, but it's a recognition that we need to do more of that, because I think the peacekeeping operations, the mandate have expanded over time, become more and more robust to the point where we've seen this kind of performance dilemmas. So partnership with others, and in this case, especially with the African-led peace operations, or African Union especially, since a large number of the operations that the UN is involved in is located in Africa. And one sub-issue that I'll just drop and not discuss in detail, and there may be questions about it, but is also the recommendation by the Secretary General that when the United Nations authorizes African-led peace operations, that they should also provide them with financial assistance and support to carry out those operations. So this essentially means the assessed contribution system that funded UN peacekeeping in the past, where all member states contribute a certain amount, that funding source should then also be used to help these African-led operations to carry out their activities. Another important element in that recommendation is that, yes, we need to take these steps to ensure that to the degree that enforcement is necessary, it's done by the right people, but at the same time, a recognition that force is not the answer. These conflicts are not going to be solved through force, right? They may be able to contain certain elements that are using violence, but to resolve those conflicts, you need the focus on political primacy and a broader comprehensive approach. So those were some of the ways in which I think we can perhaps put UN peacekeeping back on track, and some of the ways in which I think we need to recognize the limits and dangers of also the side effects we can cause even with good intentions in UN peacekeeping operations. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have.